You think you know about secret military projects? Think again, because buried in the Nevada desert, miles away from any ocean, the US military built something that sounds completely insane. They built an ocean, not a lake, not a pool, an actual ocean, deep enough to hide submarines. And they did it for reasons most people will never understand. This isn't some conspiracy theory. This is real. And the story of why they did it, how they pulled it off, and what happened there is way stranger than you'd ever imagine. So here's what you need to know about the desert ocean that changed naval warfare forever. The year is 1965. The Cold War is in full swing. The Soviet Union and the United States are locked in this race to build better weapons, better technology, better everything. And submarines are a huge part of that game. These underwater war machines can hide beneath the waves, launch missiles, gather intelligence, and disappear without a trace. But there's a problem. Testing submarines is hard, really hard. You can't just take a nuclear submarine out into the Pacific Ocean and run tests whenever you want. First off, it's expensive. Moving a submarine and all the support crews and equipment across the country costs millions. Second, it's dangerous. The ocean is unpredictable. Storms, waves, shipping lanes, foreign spy ships watching your every move. And third, it's not secure. Every time you take a sub out to sea, you risk someone seeing what you're working on. The Soviets had satellites. They had spy ships. They were watching. So the Navy had this massive problem. They needed a place to test submarines, a place where they could control every single variable, where they could test acoustic systems, sonar, propulsion, weapons, all of it, a place where no one could see what they were doing, a place that was completely secure. And that's when someone had this absolutely wild idea. What if we just build our own ocean? Not near the coast, not somewhere obvious, but right in the middle of the Nevada desert, in one of the most remote, isolated places in the entire country. Most people would have laughed at this idea, but the Navy didn't laugh. They looked at the maps, did the calculations, and realized something. This might actually work. The location they picked was about 30 miles southeast of Hawthorne, Nevada, middle of nowhere, surrounded by mountains, no major cities nearby. The closest thing to civilization was a small town that barely had 1,000 people. It was perfect. But here's the thing. They weren't going to dig a hole and fill it with water. That would be way too simple. What they needed already existed, sort of Walker Lake. This massive body of water sitting right there in the desert. It's one of only 6 natural desert terminal lakes in the entire world. Terminal means water flows in but doesn't flow out. It just sits there. And Walker Lake is deep, really deep. In some spots, it goes down more than 100 feet. For submarine testing, that's pretty much perfect. But Walker Lake had a problem. It's a natural lake. It's open to the public. People fish there. People boat there. You can't exactly test top secret submarine technology where random civilians can just show up and watch. So the Navy did something else. They found another spot nearby, a place called Hawthorne Army Depot. This place was already a military facility. It was used to store ammunition and explosives, tons of it. And right next to this depot, there was land, empty, flat, desert land. And underground, there was water. The Navy looked at this and saw potential. They could dig, they could excavate, they could create an artificial lake deep enough and big enough to test submarines. And they could do it all behind fences, behind security, behind layers of secrecy that would keep the Soviets from ever knowing what was happening. The project was called the Naval Undersea Warfare Center, Hawthorne Division, but people who worked there just called it NUWC Hawthorne, or sometimes the Desert Ocean. Construction started in the late 1960s, and this wasn't some small operation. They brought in massive excavation equipment. They dug down deep into the desert floor. They moved millions of tons of dirt and rock. They created this enormous basin, and then they filled it. The water came from underground aquifers, natural water sources buried beneath the Nevada desert. They pumped it up and filled this artificial lake until it was deep enough to submerge a submarine. We're talking about a body of water that's over 80 feet deep in some places, big enough to fit multiple submarines at once. But it wasn't just a lake. The Navy built an entire testing facility around it. They constructed labs, workshops, control rooms, sensor arrays, acoustic testing equipment, everything you'd need to analyze how a submarine performs. They built piers where subs could dock. They built cranes to lift equipment in and out of the water. They even built housing for the personnel who'd be stationed there. And all of this was hidden away in the desert, surrounded by mountains, guarded by armed security, classified to the highest levels. Now you might be wondering, why go through all this trouble? Why spend millions of dollars building a fake ocean in the desert when you could just use the real ocean? The answer comes down to control. In the ocean, you can't control anything. The water temperature changes, the salinity changes, currents move things around. There's marine life everywhere making noise, there's shipping traffic, there's weather. Every single test you run is affected by a million variables you can't control. But in the desert ocean, the Navy could control everything. They could control the water temperature, they could control the salinity, they could control the acoustic environment. No random whales swimming by making noise, no cargo ships chugging overhead, no storms rolling in and cancelling tests, just pure, controlled scientific testing. And that made all the difference. The Navy could test sonar systems and know that any signal they picked up was exactly what they wanted to measure. They could test propulsion systems and know that any vibration, any noise, any inefficiency was coming from the submarine itself, not from the environment. They could test weapon systems without worrying about losing a multi-million-dollar torpedo in the open ocean. But there's another reason this place was so valuable. Secrecy. In the Cold War, information was everything. If the Soviets knew what kind of technology the US was developing, they could counter it. They could build defenses. They could steal designs. They could get ahead. But in the Nevada desert, behind fences and armed guards, with no commercial air traffic overhead, with no satellite coverage that could see through the water, the Navy could test whatever they wanted, and no one would know. They tested submarine hulls, they tested propeller designs, they tested acoustic tiles that would make submarines quieter, they tested sonar systems that could detect enemy subs from hundreds of miles away. They tested communication systems that could send signals underwater. They tested torpedoes, missiles, everything, and all of it stayed secret. The people who lived in Hawthorne knew something was going on. They'd see military convoys rolling through town. They'd see workers heading out to the facility every day, but most of them had no idea what was actually happening out there. The Navy didn't advertise. They didn't give tours. They didn't talk about it. Even today, most of what happened at NUWC Hawthorne is still classified. The Navy has declassified some information over the years, but huge chunks of the story are still locked away. We know they tested submarines there. We know they developed technology there, but exactly what technology, exactly what capabilities they developed, that's still secret. Now here's where the story gets even more interesting. The desert ocean wasn't just used for testing regular submarines, it was used for testing experimental technology stuff that was so advanced, so cutting edge, that they couldn't risk testing it anywhere else. There are reports of unmanned underwater vehicles being tested there, drone submarines that could operate without any human crew. This was back in the 1970s and 80s, way before drones became common. The Navy was already thinking decades ahead. There are reports of advanced propulsion systems being tested, ways to make submarines move faster, quieter, more efficiently. Some of these systems were so experimental that they never made it to actual submarines, but the research done at Hawthorne helped shape the designs that did. There are even rumors, and these are just rumors, that the Navy tested submarine designs that could operate in extreme environments, not just the ocean, but under polar ice caps in shallow coastal waters, in places where traditional submarines couldn't go. And all of this happened in the desert, miles from the nearest ocean. But the desert ocean wasn't perfect. It had limitations. For one thing, it was small compared to the real ocean. You couldn't test long-range operations. You couldn't test how a submarine would perform on a month-long mission. You couldn't simulate the full complexity of actual combat scenarios. And the water itself was different. Even though the Navy controlled the salinity and temperature, it still wasn't exactly the same as ocean water. The mineral content was different. The way sound traveled through it was slightly different, so tests done at Hawthorne had to be verified later in the actual ocean. But for preliminary testing, for development work, for proving that a new technology actually worked before you risked taking it out to sea, the desert ocean was perfect. The facility operated for decades. Through the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s, NUWC Hawthorne was a critical part of the Navy's submarine program. Thousands of personnel worked there over the years. Hundreds of tests were conducted. Billions of dollars worth of technology was developed and refined. And then things started to change. By the 2000s, technology had advanced. Computer simulations had gotten incredibly sophisticated. The Navy could model submarine performance on computers with an accuracy that was almost as good as physical testing, and computer simulations were way cheaper. At the same time, the threats were changing. The Cold War was over. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The Navy was focused on different challenges: terrorism, regional conflicts, asymmetric warfare. The kind of massive submarine development programs that defined the Cold War era were scaling back. The desert ocean became less critical. Tests that used to require the facility could now be done with simulations, or they could be done at other Navy facilities that had been upgraded with newer technology. In 2000, the Navy made a decision. They were going to downsize NUWC Hawthorne. They'd keep it operational, but at a much smaller scale. Fewer personnel, fewer tests, less activity. And then in 2021, the Navy announced something bigger. They were closing the facility entirely. After more than 50 years of operation, the desert ocean was being shut down. The official reason given was cost savings. Maintaining the facility was expensive, and with modern simulation technology, it wasn't providing enough value to justify the expense. The Navy said they could do the same work at other locations for less money, but there's probably more to it than that. The technology developed at Hawthorne had served its purpose. The submarines swimming in the ocean today, the Virginia-class attack submarines, the Columbia-class ballistic missile submarines, they're the result of decades of research and testing. Much of that work was done at Hawthorne, but that work is done now. The facility had achieved what it was built for. Today, the desert ocean sits mostly empty. The water is still there, the buildings are still there, but there are no submarines, no tests, no activity. The Navy is in the process of decommissioning the site. They're removing equipment. They're securing the facility. Eventually, they'll have to decide what to do with it. Do they drain the water and fill in the lake? Do they leave it as is? Do they turn it over to another government agency? Those decisions haven't been made public yet. But the legacy of the desert ocean is still alive. Every modern US submarine in operation today benefited from the work done at Hawthorne. Every sonar system, every propulsion technology, every stealth feature, it all traces back to testing and development done in that artificial lake in the Nevada desert. The engineers and scientists who worked there developed technology that gave the US Navy a decisive advantage in submarine warfare. They created systems that made American submarines quieter, faster, more effective than anything the Soviets had. And they did it all in secret, in a place where most people never even knew existed. There's something almost poetic about it. The ocean is this vast, mysterious place that covers most of the planet. It's unpredictable, dangerous, full of unknowns. And the Navy looked at that and said, we're going to recreate it. We're going to build our own ocean where we control everything. We're going to master this environment by building a perfect copy of it in the last place anyone would think to look. And it worked. The Desert Ocean is one of the most successful secret military projects in American history. It achieved its goals. It developed technology that shaped naval warfare for generations. It did all of this without any major security breaches, without any major accidents, without any major scandals. It's a project that most people have never heard of. Even people who are interested in military history often don't know about it. But it's a perfect example of the kind of ambitious, unconventional thinking that has always defined American military innovation. When there's a problem that seems impossible to solve, you don't give up. You find a way. And if that means building an ocean in the middle of the desert, then that's what you do. The people who worked at NUWC Hawthorne understood this. They spent their careers in this remote desert facility, working on projects they couldn't talk about, developing technology that wouldn't be revealed for decades. They did it because they believed in the mission. They believed that what they were doing mattered, and they were right. The work done at the Desert Ocean helped keep America safe during one of the most dangerous periods in human history. It gave the Navy capabilities that potential adversaries couldn't match. It pushed to the boundaries of what was possible in submarine technology. Now the facility is closing. The era of the Desert Ocean is coming to an end. But the impact of what happened there will last forever. Every submarine that patrols the oceans today carries with it the legacy of that artificial lake in Nevada. Every sailor who serves on those submarines benefits from the research and testing that happened in the desert. It's a reminder that innovation doesn't always happen where you expect it. Sometimes the most important breakthroughs happen in the most unlikely places. Sometimes the key to mastering the ocean is to build your own ocean somewhere else entirely. The story of the Desert Ocean is a story about ambition, about thinking differently, about refusing to accept that something can't be done just because it's never been done before. The Navy needed a way to test submarines in a controlled environment. They needed a place that was secure, isolated, and perfect for scientific research. So they built one in the desert, miles from the nearest ocean. And it worked better than anyone could have imagined. That facility in Nevada represents a specific moment in American history. A moment when the stakes were incredibly high, when the threat was real and existential, when failure wasn't an option. The Cold War forced America to innovate in ways that seemed impossible, and the Desert Ocean is one of the most striking examples of that innovation. Today we live in a different world. The threats are different, the technology is different, the way the military operates is different. But the spirit of innovation that created the Desert Ocean is still alive. It's still driving research and development. It's still pushing boundaries. Somewhere right now, there are engineers and scientists working on projects that sound just as crazy as building an ocean in the desert. Projects that won't be revealed for decades. Projects that will shape the future in ways we can't even imagine yet. That's how progress works. That's how nations stay ahead, by taking risks, by thinking differently, by being willing to try things that seem impossible. The Desert Ocean proved that it can be done. It proved that with enough determination, enough resources, enough brilliant people working toward a common goal, you can achieve things that sound like science fiction. And maybe that's the real lesson here. The story of the Desert Ocean isn't just about submarines or testing facilities or military technology. It's about human potential. It's about what we're capable of when we refuse to accept limitations. The US military looked at an impossible problem and found an impossible solution. They built an ocean in the desert, and it changed everything. That facility may be closing now. The water may eventually be drained. The buildings may be demolished, but what happened there will never be forgotten. It's a part of history, a part of the story of how America became a naval superpower, a part of the story of innovation and determination, and the refusal to accept that something can't be done. So next time you think about submarines, next time you hear about naval warfare, next time someone tells you something is impossible, remember the desert ocean. Remember that once upon a time, the US Navy decided they needed an ocean in the middle of Nevada, and they built one, and it worked, because sometimes the craziest ideas are the ones that change the world. The desert ocean is proof of that. It's proof that innovation doesn't follow rules. It doesn't care about what's conventional or traditional or expected. It finds a way. And in a remote corner of Nevada, surrounded by desert and mountains and endless sky, that's exactly what happened. The impossible became possible, and the world was never quite the same.